Okay, welcome back to you all. We welcome you back, Dr. Loren Lybarger. For those of you who were here in December, we sort of began going through this PowerPoint, and you had lots of questions, which is wonderful. And there is still more to share. And I got more requests for a return visit from Loren than I think I have from any other speaker we have ever had before. So thank you for returning.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, sadly, there is still much to talk about here 2 months later.
Well, it's good to be back here with all of you. For anyone who wasn't here last time, my name is Loren Lybarger, and I teach at Ohio University in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies. I had my doctorate from the University of Chicago, Divinity School in the Sociology and Psychology of Religion. I did field work that was supported by the Fulbright Foundation in the West Bank in 1999-2000, right before the start of the Al-Aqsa Intifada. Prior to that, I lived in the West Bank from 1986 to 1989. So I was there during the first 2 years of the first Palestinian uprising, during which many of my students were arrested and shot. A friend of mine was shot and killed at a IDF checkpoint in Beit Jala as he was going home. He was a father just going home. Also, after the military closed all the schools, I got involved working with a human rights organization based in Jerusalem and accompanied its Palestinian field workers up and down the length and breadth of the West Bank and also in Gaza. So saw quite a bit firsthand as we documented military abuses during that first uprising. I should say the first uprising, as I experienced it and witnessed it, was largely nonviolent. A strategic decision was made by the Palestinian factions aligned with PLO to keep the guns at home. And that's not to say that the uprising was entirely nonviolent. It wasn't. It involved quite a bit of altercations and confrontations between youth who threw stones at cars and the military. And so this sort of stone throwing became kind of the signature of that first Palestinian uprising. What many people forget was that the political factions, as well as communities like Bexley, just west of or east of Bethlehem, sort of three towns there, Bethlehem, Bexley, and Beit Jala, where I live, that are predominantly Christian towns, have pioneered some really important strategic nonviolent work, including a tax strike. They refused to pay taxes to the military administration and were severely punished. Homes were blown up. The military placed a siege on Beit Lahor and went door to door, attempting to extract the tax. None of this tax money benefited the Palestinians, by the way. The money that was collected by the Israeli military was never plowed back into any sort of real infrastructure support for the communities from which the tax was extracted. So the community decided to target this. They also started their own various home enterprises, everything from sort of victory gardens, if you will, to other kinds of community-supported economic enterprises, including even trying to support a local dairy. They got these cows, I don't know where, and it kind of got kind of absurd because the IDF began chasing around these cows. A good friend of mine, Jalal Umsia, don't know, I've lost touch with him. I don't know if he's still alive, but he was one of the leaders in the community, really pushing forward these nonviolent tactics. I also got involved in teaching in underground schools, and these were schools that were held in people's homes. And I was teaching English classes. And one time I remember an IDF column coming toward the house, and we all kind of scampered out the back door with our books. The IDF began to blow up halls that were being used for teaching purposes. This is all part of sort of a practice of collective punishment that all kinds of states employ, including the United States, when they're involved in things like military occupations. The British did this, right? So this was there was a kind of continuity between the British imperial period in Palestine and its uses of these kind of tactics. And then the Israeli tactics as well. There's a kind of continuity in practice that goes from one regime to another. There's also continuity in the infrastructure. So a lot of the British military prisons became IDF military prisons in which Palestinians were then imprisoned. So it's important to sort of see the long arc of this in terms, at least from the standpoint of Palestinians. But I really wanted to emphasize the sort of nonviolent character of the first uprising in the very creative ways that Palestinians were attempting to respond. I should say also in Beit Zahor, there were active collaborations based on long-term relationships with Jewish Israeli peace movement groups who got involved in standing with Palestinians against the responses of the IDF and in favor of ending the occupation and moving toward a two-state solution. And so this is also something very important to remember, that this perception that we have of a kind of binary or dichotomy between Israelis and Palestinians, between Jews and Arabs. Actually, when we start looking at the way that these societies are highly complex societies politically, right? Ethnically, religiously, linguistically. The majority of Israelis, where they're ethnically from or what their ethnic backgrounds are? No. Middle Eastern. Yeah. Mizrahi Sephardim Jews from the Middle East make up the majority of the population in Israel. And a lot of this had to do after 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel. One of the responses of the Arab regimes was to push out their ancient, long-standing Jewish communities. This was a kind of version of what happened when Turkey and Greece fought their wars, and there was this massive, horrific exchange of populations at gunpoint. Something very similar happened here, right? And of course, we know in 1948, 750,000 Palestinians were forced out by the nascent State of Israel in order to create a Jewish majority, demographic majority, right? And Zionist leaders are very clear about this. We know this, right, from the work that Israeli and Palestinian historians have done since the 1980s. As archives have been declassified. But it's also important to recognize that a similar kind of process had occurred in response, right, to the 1948 war and the establishment of Israel, and a kind of population exchange occurred. And it was deeply wrenching and deeply destructive to the fabric of community life across the Middle East. I mean, these are ancient Jewish communities in Iraq, in Iran, in Yemen, in Morocco and other parts of the Middle East. These are Arabic-speaking Jews, right, whose culture is Middle Eastern, whose foodways are indistinguishable from the foodways of Arabs. I once, my school during the first Intifada, when all the students went home, lost its tuition base, and went to a school that was established by the Mennonite Central Committee, the group for which I work. But I've been handed over to a local charitable society, or charitable society in Beit Java. And MCC had gotten involved again financially, and so they wanted to send a volunteer, and I was that first volunteer after many, many years, decades actually, to be at the school. During the first uprising, when the military had closed all the schools, we were casting around for how to keep the school afloat financially. And these enterprising teachers said, "Oh, let's start a chicken farm or egg raising." And so we built, tells you about the sort of the enterprising nature of Palestinians who have all sorts of skills. We built these 2 chicken barns. These are large barns. And then the question became, where do we get our chickens? Yeah, you got to have chickens in order to produce eggs, in order to have a chicken or egg business. And the problem is, and this gives you some insight into the kind of ways in which the Israeli economy was enmeshed with the West Bank and Gaza after 1967. The West Bank and Gaza, through what was called an open bridges policy that the Israeli military pursued, became a kind of labor reservoir. So it became a reservoir for a lot of cheap labor. Palestinians would go to work as day laborers on Israeli farms and Israeli factories, Israeli restaurants, you name it. They were kind of the Mexicans of that, supplying the kind of Mexican labor that we are, if you're white and middle class, are very familiar with, because you see Mexicans working on people's homes or mowing their lawns or working in restaurants, right? It's the same thing in Israel, right? Palestinians were performing that role. And, relatively speaking, earning good enough wages to keep their families afloat. But they were always forced to come back. They were never allowed to stay overnight. Um, and so the West Bank and Gaza served as a kind of reservoir of labor, but also as captive markets for Israeli goods. And that's the reason why the IDF were busy chasing cows in Bexley. They did not want Palestinians developing an independent economic base, right? This is the way in which the Palestinian economy was in the occupied territories deeply enmeshed within the Israeli economy, and this served as kind of as captive market and as reservoir for cheap labor. And so, where do you think we got our chickens? The only place to get chickens was from Israel, whose industry controlled access to that resource. Well, getting permits through the Israeli bureaucracy was going to be almost an impossible endeavor. You had to go through the military. And this becomes a kind of leverage for the military with you, and you have to make all sorts of compromises and pay a lot of money. Or, what do you do?
Black market.
Black market! Right, black markets, right? Every time, into a situation where there's this kind of heavy control, people are going to exploit a black market where you can get these things for less, but it's unregulated, right? So there are all sorts of risks at it. Well, just across the border from Beit Java, kind of in the realm, vicinity of Jerusalem, was a moshav, an Israeli farm that had chickens to give us for a price, of course. So we drove over there. I was driving my colleagues, over there. It helped to have a white guy doing the driving as we passed through military checkpoints, and a blue passport that helped too. We drove to this moshav, and it was the most eye-opening experience for me, because as we got out of the car, my colleagues immediately began interacting with these Israelis in Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
And we went into kind of this office area of sorts, and they had a charcoal brazier. Is that how you pronounce it? Charcoal.
Yeah.
Hibachi thing. And they were making Arabic coffee in a panaka, kind of a, I don't know if you know Arabic coffee. You boil the grounds. It's very thick and it's very sweet because they add a lot of sugar to it. It's an acquired taste. I love it. You only drink it in small amounts. And you drink it in fenachine, which are these small little cups, demi cups. And we sat down with them, and all in Arabic. I said, "Whoa!" I mean, I started having my world was just completely. I was just like, the categories I was operating with were completely gone. Like I was like, what is this? And then it sort of, as they were talking about, their stories, it came out they were from Iraq. They were completely comfortable with my Palestinian colleagues. They understood each other implicitly. And they were speaking fluently in Arabic because that is the first language of these Iraqi Jews. Not Hebrew, Arabic. Now their children is different, right? It's Hebrew and Arabic. And they were just going off on the Ashkenazi about how unjust and unfair the class system was in Israel, in which the Ashkenazi, the European Jews who established the state and controlled the major institutions, retained political and economic control in the state. And we Ashkenazi, we do all the dirty work. Well, of course, the Palestinians do the dirtiest of the dirty work, but the Ashkenazi were just sort of one. It reminded me a little bit about the racial politics here in the United States, where if you are quote white trash, at least you aren't the quote N people, right? And so there are certain kind of compensations that come with it, right? That at least I'm not them, and that gets exploited, right, within our racial caste system in the United States. Well, something similar exists in Israel. There's a kind of racial caste system, but it was incredibly eye-opening, right? I had no idea. Anyway, complexities, right? And so my Palestinian colleagues in Beit Sahod had established these relationships with these peace activists and these rabbis who were crossing, over the checkpoints to spend the night in Beit Sahod, providing accompaniment and presence in the town in case the IDF were ever to show up in a doorstep and attempt to arrest people, right? So really powerful kind of work being done there, right? And relationships being forged through what was called the reconciliation, something reconciliation group. Anyway, again, I've managed to not even talk about the PowerPoint. So today, UNICEF just came out with a report saying that 17,000 children are unaccompanied by parents. Effectively, they are orphaned. 17,000 children. I was looking for the most recent figure, but we can estimate that at least that number of children have been killed.
After you drank the coffee, did you get the chickens?
We got the chickens. They shot up. We made a thriving egg business. I think it's still going. So we got into delivering eggs in town, kept the school afloat, thanks to the black market. So yeah, I found that really sobering. Nick Kristof, I don't know if you saw his column. I have really appreciated his columns, always have. But yesterday in his column, he was just saying, I've been very outspoken about, the human rights abuses in Ukraine and in the war in Ukraine, and in all these other in Sudan, all these other conflict places. I have to speak out now about Israel, and he's been speaking about Israel. And he made this point that he said, many people will blame Hamas for the deaths of these children and for these orphaned children. And he said, but to do that, he said, yes, Hamas certainly is to be held account, right, for its decisions. But to blame Hamas solely for this is to abdicate our moral responsibility as Americans. And he's speaking as well to his fellow Jews in Israel and the United States. It's an abdication of our moral responsibility because this scale of killing, this scale of destruction and decimation of infrastructure to make it utterly impossible for Palestinians to return to their lives ever, maybe? I mean, it just boggles the mind. There were other choices available to Israel. Other choices, just as there were other choices available to the United States in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. We did not have to destroy Afghanistan. We did not have to choose to decide to destroy Iraq. We destroyed these countries, decimated them, and we had other choices we could have made. We did. I'm not saying that there would, politically, that there would not have had to have been a response in the aftermath of 9/11. Purely in terms of political logic, yes, there would have necessity for it. Courageous leadership would have said, we have choices here, and I'm doing this and not this for these reasons. It's in our interests. And also maybe more in keeping with how we want to see ourselves as a people when we choose to respond in this way that will be less damaging to civilian lives, but also maybe address the problem. Israel had other choices, but it chose instead for biblical proportional. For Joshua's style decimation and destruction. That's the choice being made. That was made and is continuing to be made. And as Nick Kristof says, we advocate our moral responsibility by not speaking out about this. So these numbers are off. I need to adjust them. There are now almost 27,000 Palestinians killed and close to 65,000 injured. The numbers for the Israelis remain the same, give or take. There are Israeli hostages who remain hostages whose families have been devastated and traumatized. Israeli families who have lost children, who lost family members in that brutal attack by Hamas remain devastated and traumatized. And of course, the entire population of Gaza. Millions of people, thousands, hundreds of thousands, 1.1, 2 million people, the entire population is devastated and traumatized, displaced, and on the brink of famine. Israel's response has been massive and indiscriminate, regardless of what the IDF and the political leaders say about having passed out leaflets and contacted people electronically, even though the Wi-Fi used to really operate. It's all nonsense, because when you look at the actual impact, the actual stuff that has happened, that's the policy. What's the policy? It's all these people killed. And all of the, there was a link that Julie, you shared. We can watch it, maybe we should, of the IDF going around and detonating entire blocks. Not along some sort of security barrier, but inside Gaza. This is deliberate policy. This is the policy. Right? And of course, the desire is to blame Hamas. So all of this would not have happened except for Hamas. There were other choices you could have made by the political leadership in this moment, other choices. But what we see being enacted on the ground is very consistent with a policy that desires to ultimately to push this entire population out of Gaza, or much of it. Why else would you destroy cultural sites? Why would you destroy hospitals? Why would you destroy mosques? Why would you destroy block after block of residential housing? Does every single house have a tunnel in it? And even if it did, would that justify this level of destruction? This is Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, this is biblical destruction. I guess the goal is collective punishment and deterrence. I mean, this is one hell of a deterrence, I guess. But if you traumatize an entire generation, you have seeded the land with salt, you have poisoned the land. And it's really hard to know how to come out of this. So why is the violence happening? Well, one of the basic points that needs to be made is that this did not begin on October 7th. This is not when history starts, right? And we talked last time, I think, about competing narratives, right? I think it's really important to bear in mind that the history can be told in many different ways. I'm listening to Amos Oz's book, Tale of Love and Darkness. I think that's the title of it. Been listening to it. I commute to OU from here, and so it gives me a lot of time to do a lot of bucket list reading. But actually, yeah, Amos Oz, he's a Zionist, but one who came to embrace a two-state solution and actually has a real capacity for empathy and a capacity to question the Israeli narrative as much as he is a believer in it, right? So Amos Oz provides a kind of different history, and he recounts the devastating attack of the Arab armies in the immediate aftermath of the vote by the UN for partition and the vote for support of an Israeli state and the immediate attack that was launched by Arab armies. It was good for me to hear this, right? Because I have looked very skeptically on that narrative, right? Because I feel that narrative has often been used to deny the validity of the Palestinian narrative, which gets absolutely no airtime and that nobody hears about. But as soon as Amos Oz describes this and describes the jubilation of his family and his neighbors as they're listening to this announcement from Lake Success in New York, he also says, but not the entire city was celebrating. Half the city was in mourning, right? And so there's this capacity for empathy, right, that he has, even if I'm not entirely on board completely with his narrative, right? But I think it's really, really important for us to be open to that play of narratives, right? The contestation of narrative, because a lot of the problem is that, like, we can't get on the same page about the story, right? And you have competing narratives. And it's really important to be able to say, okay, I need to listen to this narrative, right? He speaks of Israel as you know, a people that is half hysterical because of the Holocaust. And being able to remember that, right, is really critical in this moment as anti-Semitism spikes globally and in this country, alongside of anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia spiking in this moment. So keeping your heart open, right, to that and intellectually honest with yourself, right, about, you know, the ways in which, you know, the United States, Christians in the West, churches in the West have been complicit, were complicit, right, in the Holocaust and in the denial of you know, closing borders to Jews seeking refuge here in the United States, for example. Ken Burns has a new documentary on the Holocaust. I haven't seen America and the Holocaust. How many of you have seen it? It's on PBS.
Is it out yet?
I think it's out.
Yes, it's been out.
For a while.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it. I'm interested in seeing it, but I think part of that narrative he's going to discuss in that, or does discuss in that documentary, is the policy of the United States to refuse entry to Jewish refugees. Right? I mean, that's something that the United States Americans don't like to think about or don't even know about. So the complicity, right? But there's a complicity as well in the suffering of the Palestinians. Long established complicity in that. That's ongoing in this very moment because it is US bombs that have destroyed Gaza. These are US supplied munitions that are being used. 2,000-pound J-band bombs. Dung bombs as well. Supplied by you and me, you know, every year when we pull out our credit card or whatever, however we pay the IRS, was it 50% of our tax dollars goes to the military, right? And a lot of that money goes into support things like what is currently occurring in Gaza. So we are deeply implicated in a lot of ways as citizens, and we have a moral responsibility that we abdicate if we don't speak out. Okay. And I don't mean to be a nag because I don't speak up as you know, to the degree that I should as well, right? All right. So I think it's important to remember that the history does not begin on October 7th, and there's a real need for context. And in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, to ask for context, to demand context, was excoriated as moral equivocated, right? No, there's no context. This is completely evil, what Hamas has done. Okay. The thing is, you understand nothing if that's your beginning point. I mean, what about these questions? What is Hamas? Where did Hamas come from? What's this boundary, this wall that was created that they broached? And what about these communities here where did the Palestinians in Gaza come from? What about these things that I've heard about, like refugee camps? Where did those come from? Sure. And why would Hamas choose to do this anyway? What do we know about Hamas? Oh, all of it starts to get us into what is called context. we need this to understand this moment and to demand that we not look at this and completely adopt a binary narrative of good versus evil. That might feel very good and very sort of self-justifying, but it really has a lot of dangers, right? Because if we don't understand what is going on, if we don't have a context, then we risk making a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of moral risk. We risk allowing exactly what is occurring to happen. Why? Because you cannot negotiate with evil. An evil Hamas, and by extension, the entire Gaza Strip is evil. It cannot be abided, and therefore we are completely morally justified in destroying all of it and all of it. Because these are evil people. This is existential. It is either us or them. Either we live and they die, or we die. Because they will stop at nothing to cut our throats. If you pause for a moment and think about context, then things become much more complicated because it becomes much harder to sustain that kind of dichotomy, to see the other as entirely evil. And if you cannot see the other as entirely evil, then you have to think in more complex terms about the way that you respond to something like that. Okay. So why is this violence happening now? Well, first of all, in the immediate context, this is the culmination or the latest in a series of much smaller wars that Israel and Hamas have fought with one another since 2005, more or less. Why is 2005 important? Because that's when Ariel Sharon, the prime minister of Israel at that time, decided to redeploy Israel. I say redeploy, not remove, but redeploy the Israeli military to the borders of the Gaza Strip and to remove the Israeli settlements. And this was completely a pragmatic decision. It's not because Ariel Sharon loves Palestinians, quite the opposite. Ariel Sharon was one of the strongest forces for settlement. Very strong, kind of Jabotinsky-like kind of Zionist. He was the architect of the invasion of Lebanon that resulted in the killing of 17,000 Lebanese and Palestinian civilians. It's Ariel Sharon, right? But he withdraws the military in 2005 from Gaza and takes the settlers out. And immediately, Israel imposes a siege of the Gaza Strip. And they reinforce, start to create this high-tech border. And they use these 2 or 3 entry points with Gaza as spigots that they can turn off and on to control what comes in and what comes out. So a kind of regime of control is established in 2005 that creates a situation of siege in which Palestinians are being sort of kept on life support. 80% of the Palestinian population before October 7th was living at or near the international poverty line of $2 a day. 80% of the population was entirely dependent on international aid, or dependent to some degree, one degree or another. Nothing got into the Gaza Strip except by Israel's say-so. So this idea that Israel sort of handed over Gaza to the Palestinians and so the Palestinians are to blame for everything that's happening is complete bunk. Israel remained the occupier. It just simply reconfigured how it was occupying Gaza. And the way that it was choosing to do so was to create a kind of siege situation. Or there's a better term than siege. Help me out. Maybe siege is the right term. Okay. Under those kinds of conditions, then at the same time, the Oslo peace process was falling apart. I don't know if you remember, the Oslo peace process began with the Oslo Memorandum of Understanding, which was announced in September of 1990. I remember this because I had just come back from the Middle East after living in the Middle East for 7 years to Chicago. And within a month, the Memorandum of Understanding was announced. I just met, I had a couple of friends who were connected to kind of the activist community in Chicago, and she invited me to a meeting at Random Worlds Cafe on the north side. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was owned by a Palestinian. And there was this huge meeting of activists and community leaders at this cafe. It's also where I happened to meet my wife, Mary, who yeah, I was very, very fortunate events to occur. My wife, thanks to Oslo. So we go to this meeting, and yeah, anyway, that's why I remember so that it's a nice one, the Oslo Peace Accord. I've been in Gaza for 2 years just prior to that, and I was just desperate. It was after the first Gulf War. Israel had used the opportunity of the first Gulf War to really impose the kind of clamp down on the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and it's really what allowed Israel to finally finish off the first Intifada. I just remember Israeli undercover units operating at will. There was a big curfew. I remember the Israeli undercover units because I was actually stopped by one. A friend and I were coming back from a party. We thought as white people we were going to be able to sort of be exempt from the curfew, but no. And all of a sudden, out of the darkness, these men, this undercover commando unit was at us with M16 rifles pointed in their car. And, sweating. I think we were the soldiers themselves were very nervous. And Doug, my friend, was screaming out of his head with fear. But it gave me some insight into how things were really operating in Gaza at the time, when Israel was directly involved in the military operation of the Strip. But 1993 happened, the Oslo Accords happened, and Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, signed a memorandum of understanding. Right from the very beginning, the whole process was fraught. But it was really seen as a breakthrough. And people in Gaza, the population in Gaza and the West Bank, were celebrating. You have to understand, this was seen as a major breakthrough. This was the whole goal of the Intifada, was to move toward a two-state solution. And for the Palestinians, the Oslo Accords was going to be that deal, right, that was going to get them their state. From the perspective of the Israeli leaders, Rabin himself, that's not how it was sold to the Israeli public. How was it sold to the Israeli public? This will allow us to no longer have to directly occupy the Palestinians because the Palestinians will do this themselves much more effectively. The Palestinians will police themselves much more effectively. So it was sold to the Israelis in terms of security. But there was no talk of a Palestinian state. We will give the Palestinians some autonomy. We'll see how that goes. The main thing is security, 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 security. It's all about the security arrangements. And the United States failed miserably, utterly failed. And this one reason why we have October 7th is because the United States failed to understand that the Oslo Accords needed to succeed in a Palestinian state in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and in the Gaza Strip in its entirety, not in small enclaves and sectioned off bits and pieces, which is what it became, but in an actual viable state. That's what needed to happen. And why? Because the Palestinians, as they understood it, had already compromised. How? By giving up on the 78% of Palestine that became Israel. Their historic compromise was that, accepting partition finally. After decades of refusing to accept that, from their perspective, deep injustice, because they had been, by far, the majority population in Palestine, and were never consulted, ever consulted, on the idea of establishing a Jewish state for a population that was very much a minority population. The Palestinians were never consulted by the British. And so for the Palestinians finally to accept partition was huge. And the Algiers Declaration, Yasser Arafat declared the state of Palestine. He declared it in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. But that was not good enough for the Israelis, and that was not good enough for the United States. The Palestinians were going to be willing to accept less. Less. Probably because you had all these Israeli settlements. And there were some, right, where the Palestinians could have gotten close, right? And there were some mistakes that were made, absolutely made, horrendous mistakes by Arafat in the Palestinian leadership, right? I mean, That has to be said. They could have done things better, made better decisions. But I think a fundamental misunderstanding comes from a failure to understand things from the Palestinian perspective and understand really where the red lines were, beyond which Arafat could not go. And the United States failed. As Aaron David Miller put it, who was very involved in the State Department in these negotiations, in the article that you all should read, the United States played the role of Israel's lawyer. He came up with that phrase, Israel's lawyer. Thumb very much on the Israeli side of the scale. October 7th is the result of the failure of diplomacy. And the failure of diplomacy, meaning the failure of the Oslo peace process, and to establish a viable two-state solution. This is what happens when diplomacy fails. And that failure being deeply rooted in a lack of empathy, a lack of capacity, the lack of a kind of an almost biased ability, right, to understand what this looks like from the standpoint of your enemy. And if this is the way it looks, they have given up 78%. From your standpoint, they have given up 78%. That's actually quite a bit. Regardless of how we might feel about that, right? But they, sent their Arab armies after us in 48, that they never failed to miss an opportunity. That they have set off bombs in our cafes and our restaurants, which Hamas and Islamic Jihad have done and did. That the PLO sent their fighters to shoot up Israeli buses, which they did. Nevertheless, we understand that if we were in their shoes, maybe we would do the same thing. And maybe we would feel the same way. We gave up 78%. So from that standpoint, maybe we might understand that our task is to come as close as we can to what they need, which is that remaining 22%, including Eastern Jews. I don't know. I mean, hindsight is 2020, and I think the UN partition resolution looks really good from where we stand now. The Palestinians would have had more territory, and Jerusalem would have been a corpus separatum under international control. But that's not how things evolved. And now things are sort of so utterly desperate. We're looking at a slow motion process of ethnic cleansing in the West Bank as the settlers run rampant, uncontrolled by the Netanyahu government, actually empowered by them, using this moment as cover to attack Palestinian rural communities and farmers. So it's quite desperate. So there's alongside of this, I mentioned the dysfunctions in Palestinian leadership. I mean, pretty quickly, the Palestinian National Authority became associated with a lot of corruption and inability really to represent Palestinian interests in any effective way. There's nothing but disdain for the secular Palestinian leadership now. So there's been a fundamental failure in the PLO, in the Palestinian National Authority leadership of Fatah movement. The secular movement has been shown to be quite corrupt and co-opted, basically Israel's policemen in the occupied area. Netanyahu, for his part, has done everything in his power, in his decades in power, his many years in power, to undermine the peace process. He's been very open about never wanting to allow the Palestinian Authority doing everything he can to undermine, the Palestinian state. Bragging about them, saying this is kind of his re-election slogan. I will not allow a Palestinian state, right? Tells you a lot about where Israeli society is at the moment. It doesn't make anything have any traction, but it does. Has a lot of traction. But he's opposed to the Palestinian state for a very long time, and arguably even under Labour Party rule during the Oslo process, there wasn't any sort of real. I mean, when Barack was prime minister, and I think he was prime minister when I was there in 1991, 2000. Israeli settlement building was just unrelenting. And in Bethlehem, there was this huge settlement that was being built on what is called, Israelis call Har Homa. Palestinians refer to it as Jebel Abu Ghneim. This is land that was taken from Bethlehem. It's appropriated by the state of Israel. And it's now become this gigantic apartment complex. It's effectively a settlement that is part of a ring of settlements that cuts off Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank. Shop owner said to me, somebody I got to know fairly well in Bethlehem, pointed at Jebel Abu Ghneim, Har Homa, and he said, if this is peace, show me war. So there was deep dissatisfaction and disillusion with the Palestinian Authority leadership, and deep cynicism about what Oslo was really doing. Because on the ground, I keep talking about, let's look at what's happening on the ground, because that's the policy. What was happening on the ground during Oslo? Settlement bills. That was the policy, at least part of it. Along with allowing a degree of Palestinian autonomy within highly circumscribed population centers. And to leave those population centers, you require a pass. So there's no mystery as to why Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International issued reports finally saying that what exists in the occupied territories is a form of apartheid. Jeff Halper, an Israeli geographer, came up with the term that he referred to this whole sort of system that was set up as a matrix of control. A matrix of control. The system of parallel roads, the system of checkpoints, the system of the wall that went up, all of this was functioning as a matrix of control. That looks a lot like the way that apartheid worked in South Africa. If that's the future that Israel wants, it seems to be, right? If that's either wholesale expulsion, which seems to be the policy in Gaza, or long-term apartheid rule, honestly, I don't know how that's sustainable. Now, the response will be, we have nobody to talk to on the Palestinian side. Well, one reason why you don't have anybody to talk to on the Palestinian side is that you have undermined Palestinian leadership from the get-go for years. And now that leadership is old, corrupt, incapable of, and there have been no elections, incapable of representing Palestinian interests. Hamas, I don't know. I don't know if there will ever be an accounting for Hamas by the Palestinian people. But we do know that in Gaza, Gazans are asking some very hard questions of Hamas. Hamas came out a couple of weeks ago, maybe it was just last week, with a document justifying its decision on October 7th. Why do they feel the need to publish something like that? It was in Arabic and English. Who was the audience for that, do you think? Well, partly international, but also domestic. Basically, the argument was, what choice did we have? But my God, what incredible, horrific consequences of those choices. What choices you had? You had other choices. You had other choices, other ways you could have gone to confront and contest this matrix of control. As hard as that would have been, there were other choices than to send your fighters into southern Israel and carry out a mass slaughter.
What might those have been?
Well, last time I talked about strategic nonviolence, I have talked about the choices that were made in Bexley. Choices that were also made by the activists of the Arab Spring, who were reading Gene Sharp's work. I don't know if you know who Gene Sharp was. He taught at Harvard University for many, many years and wrote voluminously about strategic nonviolence. His work was being closely read by the leaders of the Arab Spring uprisings in Egypt, Tunisia, and elsewhere. Now, Palestinians will say, well, we tried. What about boycott, divestment, and sanctions? There have been multiple laws and resolutions passed in this country, in this city, in this state, outlawing boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and calling it anti-Semitic. What about the attempt of Gazans to go to the fence in Gaza and it would come down in their hundreds by Israeli soldiers, simply for marching on the fence? And my response to that is, you're right. But you got to pay that. And it's easy for me to say, right? Like I'm not the one who's going to pay the price, right, for this. But if you're willing to send people to their deaths as martyrs in an armed attack, you could maybe think about this in a different way to say, well, okay, we are going to incur deaths in any sort of strategic nonviolent action. Marching on the fence, let's do that again and again and again. And let's get savvy about our media around that. And let's start working with Israelis. Let's try to, because this will empower the defunct Israeli left and the Israeli peace movement. But let's start cooperating that like that. In the same way that the Bexley horror people did with the rapprochement center. How can we reestablish those solidarity links? Many of the people who were targeted on October 7th, who were killed on October 7th on the other side of the border with Gaza, Israelis, the peace activists. Yeah. And what was Hamas thinking here? They weren't thinking about this. I mean, they were, of course, thinking in very particular terms in ways about this, right? They had to know that there would be an overwhelming response. I don't know that they necessarily thought that they were surprised by the lack of an Israeli military response. I think that they were completely expecting to be martyred, right? To go to their deaths as martyrs, and some kind of conflagration with the Israeli military, but the Israeli military never showed up, and their fighters went on a rampage. So who knows? Yeah, I'm sorry, Brad.
So, pick up somewhat on Dave's comment, but also you mentioned apartheid. Is there any possibility of something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened in South Africa? Because I'm remembering back to the early mid-'80s when, at least where I was in school at that point, and a lot of conversation about divesting South Africa, but it seemed like an impossibility that,
Yeah.
And then by 1990,
Well, a friend of mine,
a little bit different leadership, and you get some people. You get the Desmond Tutus and the Nelson Mandelas and so forth. But I don't know, is there anything like that possible? I mean, I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was just like incredible. That was amazing. Where did that come from? I don't know. Is that even
not uncontroversial in South Africa?
Oh, is it?
It was not uncontroversial in South Africa.
No, I mean, controversial. I just mean it's amazing. Something that meaningful
Yeah.
could come out of this mess. Maybe I got that read wrong, but I still sort of marvel that. I thought in the early '80s, from reading I've been doing, there was going to be bloodshed and revolution in South Africa. I mean, it was going to be fighting in the streets, right to the death, and that wasn't what happened in Bexley. Something else happened, but how do we?
Well, you had examples of this in the townships, right? The images of people being executed in the streets. You had sort of necklacing with tires being set on fire around so many people's necks. This was sort of black on black violence. But you also had, South African military gunning people down. It was so. I mean, that possibility was very. You're right. I was involved in some of that. I was in college from '82 to '86, and I was involved in trying to get my college, a Quaker college, to divest. And it did seem impossible, but lo and behold, things change quickly. A friend of mine who is a dear friend, he's a South African, a Jew, who during the first Palestinian uprising refused to serve in the IDF and was jailed and declared insane and then let go. These aren't insane. One of the most intelligent people I know has a PhD. I mean, not to say you can't be brilliant and insane. But what I mean by that is that he was quite in possession of his faculties. It was just a convenient way for the, same thing happened here in the United States in the First World War with conscientious objectors. They were one way that the system dealt with it was to declare them insane, then let them go. So David, very involved in the anti-occupation and peace movement work. As a PhD from Hebrew University in Political Science, he ultimately converted to Christianity, became a Jesuit. It's a very complicated story. He's gay also, and was in a long-term gay relationship with a wonderful woman who owned a restaurant in Jerusalem. But then David, became a Christian and a Jesuit priest, and has risen up into the ranks in Jerusalem. He split his time between Jerusalem and Johannesburg now. Brilliant, one of the most brilliant people I know, just sort of multilingual, just amazing. He and I had a long exchange of emails where I was just sort of working through my own feelings and thoughts, and one of these conversations about that begins with "Where is God?" and all this. And David's immediate reply is, "God is in with the children in Gaza. That's where God is." And our conversation evolved from there. But he made the point, Brad, that you just made, that the only thing that gives him hope right now is that things can change very quickly. This is as a South African immigrant. And so I don't know. Maybe the Biden, as disgusted as I am with Biden's refusal to rein in the Netanyahu government in any way that's effective. Maybe if he can manage it, to move this forward toward a real two-state solution, maybe then that will be that kind of moment, right, where things shift very quickly. And it could happen, right? I mean, the UK is talking about recognizing the state of Palestine. That would be huge. That's not happened, that kind of international legitimacy, where it becomes harder and harder and harder for the Israeli government to say no. And it's been done before. James Baker and George Bush one withheld $10 million or $10 billion in N or B, I don't know. A lot of money in housing guarantees for the Israeli state. That was a part of the stick that was used to get a recalcitrant Prime Minister Shamir to Madrid, which preceded the whole Oslo process. So the U.S. has shown willingness to use the leverage it has with Israel. So who knows? Many people in the region, including David, said, we need the Americans to step in. And that's why I say there's a lot of responsibility on our shoulders, right, for this as well. Yeah.
How do you see the people in Israel coming to some kind of a peace when you have, I don't want to say all the Middle East, but the Middle East wanting to destroy Israel?
Well, I don't think that's true.
You don't? I do.
When you say all the Middle East, what do you mean?
I'm saying there's a group of, it seems like it's the people in the Middle East want to kill the people in Israel. So how do you see?
What is the foundation? I guess I'm asking you, where are you reading this? Where are you getting that information or that perception?
On the news?
Okay, so what news are you reading? Where are you getting it?
CNN and SNBC. It's not Fox.
So I read pretty heavily. I read the New York Times and the Washington Post, and that's not the perception I'm getting at all.
I get that out of the Washington Post.
I don't get that at all. I also am looking at Arab newspapers and Haaretz in Israel I'm not getting that perception at all. Does the Arab public opinion support the Palestinians, and are they outraged by what is happening? Absolutely. Does that mean that they want to slaughter and kill every last Israeli? That's a big step. Maybe some of them do, and maybe some do. Arabs have their Netanyahus. Arabs have their Ben Gavirs. They have their fascists. But to make sweeping statements that the entire Middle East wants to slit the throat of Israelis, that to me seems a bit of a stretch. And that's why I was asking, where are you getting that? What data are you drawing on? Look, public attitudes can change, and they can change through the decisions that leaders make and the kind of messaging that leaders start to put out there, right? We can move very quickly to support for two states if and when Israeli leaders and American leaders start to talk about this as important to do.
I agree.
The same thing is possible in Arab states right now, because Arab leaders very much want to cut a deal with Israel. One of the carrots on the table to move Israel toward a two-state solution is a deal with Saudi Arabia, who said, if you embrace the Arab peace plan, which is what? Palestinian state in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, if you embrace that, you get normalization. Bingo. That's a huge carrot. So how are they going to justify that to their people? Well, if the Palestinians say, we want this, what are the Arab people going to say? Finally, some justice has been done. Does that mean that there won't be groups that set against this? No. Does that mean that Iran possibly will be set against this? No. Iran could very well maintain its oppositional stance, but will increasingly become isolated in the region. To the extent that the region moves on, it perceives that the Palestinian question has been substantially resolved, if not entirely resolved. We have to be realistic about a two-state solution. It's going to be really hard to achieve. And what does it mean to have a viable Palestinian state that is geographically segmented and economically really from a very shattered position?
What do you see as the best way to get there when we don't have good leadership on either side right now?
I don't know. And we almost need, in a sense, to create a situation where Netanyahu has no choice, where for his own political survival, he has to embrace a two-state solution and cut his ties with the settlers. But for that to happen, there have got to be huge upsides for him. But he's a political animal, right? And he's capable of changing spots on his coat pretty quickly. So, well, who knows? Maybe we get a Nixon to China kind of thing. I'm aware. It's completely unexpected, right? But being driven by very pragmatic political interests, and Netanyahu is nothing but politically pragmatic.
Bill and Julie, and then I think we'll Bill. Okay, I was going to have us finish up with your two questions. If you okay. So Julie, and then we can finish.
I sometimes, in my opinion, at this point, Israel is losing I have never seen so much pro-Palestinian thought in America. I haven't seen so much empathy for Palestinians as I have in the news because of how biblical Israel's reaction has been. And with South Africa filing with the international, and with some of those things, it's like one thing that in the back of my mind is, and I don't want to say, but in some sense that Hamas began a process that is leading to this kind of destruction But I just don't think a lot of people can stomach what's happening in Gaza, the
Right,
degree to which it's happening.
right.
So I think there is political pressure for the first time I've seen it, real pressure in the Democratic Party to say to President Biden, no, we're not just gonna like, we don't like your blank slate that you're giving Israel. We don't like what you're doing here. So my one hope is that this devastation will give an opening in the peace process that hasn't existed for a long time. Because when I went over there in 2016, one of the things I walked away from was I don't understand how these Palestinian people are not violently reacting just in their everyday life. And that wasn't during any conflict in particular. It's just the essence of having a limited supply of water while you look across to a settlement that's lush in the desert.
Right.
Because the inequality and the is so daily obvious.
Yeah.
But there was no traction. You'd never hear about it. Now, do I read something that's pro-Palestinian on the front page? And a much more, it's that part of it, that part of the media thing seems to me to be changing in a way it hasn't existed in my
Yeah, I mean, I guess I agree with you. I was listening to Michael Barbaro's the daily podcast, New York Times daily podcast, and he had a segment, I think, last on Friday on President Biden and the pitch that he needs to make to South Carolinians, Black voters, the problems that the Biden campaign is facing. And it was interesting in the midst of that podcast, they interviewed faith leaders, Black faith leaders in South Carolina, who said that their constituents, their people in the pews are deeply troubled with anger at Biden or its support of Netanyahu and his policies. There's something going on here with Black voters, and especially Black Christians who are involved in the churches, and it's through the churches that the Black vote gets out. Where this particular issue is really in the negative way. Black voters contributed to the dissatisfaction that Black voters have with Biden. The Biden campaign they obviously had trouble in Michigan.
yes,
Yes. We have real trouble. And everywhere that Biden goes, he's being dogged by protesters, very loud protesters on this issue. So I think this is part of the pressure in Biden, and the Democrats are anything but, if they're not anything new. If they're not political, then they're nothing, right? And that they're deeply political, obviously, very worried about this. So maybe that becomes a pressure point. But you and I have been involved in this issue, Julie, for long enough to know that American public opinion is fickle.
yeah.
And as soon as this disappears from the front pages, Americans don't care. And politics will move on. I hope that's not the case. I really sincerely hope that that's not the case. And I do hope that out of this profound tragedy, a two-state solution, which for me is not the ideal solution, but it's the only one that has any chance of going. But a viable two-state solution can become established. Because I think many Israelis understand what needs to happen. And many Israelis want to believe in the justice of Israel, in the goodness of Israel. And understand that they will have to live with the Palestinian leaders at the cost of mass ethnic cleansing and mass death is much too high. It's already too high. But when you have this kind of violence that occurs on October 7th, this becomes existential for people, right? It's felt this way at a very deep existential level. I mean, think of 9/11, how Americans felt about that, right? And the kind of emotion that was driving it, a very angry, reactive politics. That's what's happening. So we need to be empathetic with them and understand that that's where this is coming from and why there's support for what's happening in Gaza. But in the long term, right, when we step back and say, well, this is just isn't viable, right? And if you look, if you are sympathetic to Israel, if you have in memory the Holocaust, right, and you accept the arguments made by Israel and its supporters that without Israel, Jews are deeply vulnerable in this world. If you accept those arguments, and I would say that many Jews don't. There's a good article in the New York Times about diasporism among Jews in the United States who are involved in groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now. They've been at the forefront of these demonstrations against what's happening in Jewish groups and embracing the diaspora as the as a legitimate framework for Jewish life. But there are, I would say, a majority of Jews who continue to support Israel and have a kind of deep sense of vulnerability in this world. And what happened on October 7th simply just reaffirms that for them, right? That we are deeply vulnerable in this world, and we need a place to protect us, even if October 7th also sort of undermines that idea of the state can protect. But if that's where you're coming from, then I would hope you would want the very best for Israel. And not to my mind, the very best for Israel would be a just peace with the Palestinians that can be sustained over the long term. But you're only going to get there if you accept that the Palestinians need to have their place in the sun too, in their historic homeland. They too belong to this land. So no throwing Jews into the sea, no slitting their throats, but equally no throwing the Palestinians into the desert and stop at slitting throats. Let's stop slitting throats and let's stop throwing people into the sea or into the desert, whether figuratively or in real. And let's try to figure something else out. Two states, possibly in the future becoming because you're going to be deeply reliant on one another. I talked about the way that the West Bank and Gaza were economically enmeshed in Israel. Well, that's going to be a continuing reality. So there's going to be a lot of important thinking to do about how to achieve a just economy. And both peoples having access to both territories, the capacity and the right to buy property, to live in both places, even if they're voting for separate governments, whatever. It's too small of a place to not be thinking in long-term terms in terms of confederacy. Or Confederate state, which is Confederacy runs but a confederated state, but that's long future. Hopefully we'll have our South African moment on I don't know if there's a Desmond Tutu or a Mandela. I mean, Marwan Barghouti is not exactly Mandela, but maybe he's somebody who can out of prison and maybe he's somebody who can actually speak for Palestinians. So,
Right. Thank you very much, Lauren.